Hello friends, welcome back to CSharp.net online training video series. Today we are going to discuss generic delegates in C Sharp, right? So as part of this video, what we are going to discuss? We are going to discuss the following 7 pointers. First, we will discuss what are generic delegates. Then we will discuss the different types of generic delegates provided by .NET Framework. Then we will discuss why do we need generic delegates with one real-time example. Then we will try to understand the different types of generic delegates such as Func, action, and predicate, and we will understand all these three different generic delegates by taking some different kind of examples, right? So, what are generic delegates? The generic delegates are introduced as part of .NET Framework 3.5, which does not require to define the delegate instance in order to invoke the methods. What it means as of now how we are going to use the delegate. First of all, we need to declare the delegate, then we need to create an instance of the delegate, then we need to invoke the delegate, right? So creating the delegate that statement creating the delegate is no longer required if you use this generic delegate. How? That we are going to discuss. But before that, if you have not watched our previous three videos where we discussed single cast delegate, multicast delegate, and generic delegates real-time example, please watch those three videos before proceeding to this video, right? So now we understand what is generic delegates. Now let us try to understand what are the different types of generic delegates provided by .NET Framework. .NET Framework provides three different generic delegates for three different scenarios. So three different generic delegate means what? It means for three different kind of functions, we can use these three different generic delegates. Let us try to understand how we can use or why we need to use generic delegates with one real-time example, right? Suppose you can see there are three different functions, right? This is add number one function, which is taking the first input parameter as integer, second as float, and third one is double, and it is going to return me one double type value. And this is the second example, the second function, that is add number two, which is also taking the same input parameter as the add number one method, but in this case it is not returning me anything, so the return type is void. And the third method, you can see this check length method, which is taking one input parameter of string type, and it is going to return me a boolean value. So what is the business logic we have implemented here is, if the length is if the string length is greater than 5 characters, then it is going to return me true, and if the length is not greater than 5, then it is going to return me false. Now, as the method signature, as you can see, each method signature is different, right? Then if we want to invoke this add number one method, add number two method, and a check length method using delegates, then first of all, we need to create three delegates, right? And each delegate signature should be same as these methods, right? For example, if you want to invoke these three methods, then you need to create a three delegates like this. One delegate, for this, let assume this add number one method. Its return type is boolean, and it is taking integer, float, and a double. That means we need to create one delegate which is going to return me a double value, and which is going to take integer, float, and a double parameter. So this is one delegate, and this delegate is basically going to invoke the add number one method, right? For add number two method, what should be the signature of the delegate? The delegate should have the return type as void, and it is also going to take integer, float, and a double parameter. If you look at the second delegate signature, that is add number two delegate, you can see the return type is void, and it is taking number one, integer, float, and a double parameter as input parameter, right? Now coming to this check length method, so what we need to do, we need to create one delegate, and that delegate is going to return me a boolean value, and that delegate is going to take a string parameter, right? So now if you come to this part, then you can see the third delegate which we created, check length delegate, it is going to take one string parameter, and it is going to return me one boolean value, right? So once you have these three delegates, and once you have these three methods, right, then what you need to do, then you can create an instance of the delegate, right? And while creating the instance, you need to pass the method name as a parameter. For example, if you are creating add number one delegate instance, then you need to pass add number one method as a parameter. And once you pass the method as a parameter, then you can invoke the delegate instance directly like a method, or even you can also use this invoke method, right? We have already discussed this both approaches. And while you are invoking the method, so you need to pass three parameters. First one is integer, second float, and the third one is double. Integer, float, and double. And you can see this delegate is returning some data. Which type of data? Double. So I'm storing the output or returning value in a variable of a double type, and then printing that value what it's returning by this delegate instance, right? Now, if you want to use this add number to delegate, then you need to pass one method whose signature should match with this, and which method signature is the same as add number to delegate. The add method to signature is taking three parameter but not returning anything. So in this case, you can see while creating the instance of add number to delegate, I'm passing the method as a parameter, and then I'm just invoking the delegate instance. In this case, this method does not return anything, or you can see this delegate doesn't return anything. So I'm not using any kind of equal assignment here, right? So simply I'm invoking the delegate. Now for the check length method, you can do the same thing. You can pass the method name as a parameter, and when you invoke, you need to pass some string value. And this check length method, if you look at the signature, it is going to return me either true and false, and that return value I'm going to store inside a boolean variable, and then finally I'm printing the value. So this is how, as of now, we have discussed how to create delegate, how to declare delegate, and how to invoke delegates. That is what we have already so far we have discussed. Now the same thing I have written here. These are my delegate signatures, right? And these are my handler methods, or you can say methods, right? The delegate is going to be execute. So this is my add number one delegate, which is going to execute add number one method, and this is add number two delegate, which is going to execute add number two method, and this check length method is going to be invoked by this check length delegate, right? So this is how we are using delegate as of now. Now, if you run the application, then you will see that the output as expected, right? So in this case, there is no issue. That is fine. And this is how we have discussed so far how to use delegates in CSharp. Now the question is, do we really need to create the custom delegate to invoke the method? First of all, do we need to create these things to invoke the method? Do we need to declare this custom delegate in order to invoke these three methods? The answer is no. We should not do this. Then who is going to do this? The .NET framework provides some built-in generic delegates who can do the job for us. Basically, the .NET framework provides three different types of delegates, right? Generic delegates, you can say those are Func, action, and predicate. Now let us proceed and try to understand what all these delegates are, when and how to use these generic delegates in C#. So you can see there are three different types of a delegate. One is Func, action, and the predicate. Let us try to understand each one by one. The Func generic delegate is present in system namespace, right? If you write here Func, okay, if you want to see, right? And if you go to the definition, then you will see that this Func generic delegate is present or belongs to the system namespace, right? And the delegate takes one or more input parameter and returns one output parameter. That means in this case, you can pass maximum 16 input parameter, right? And of different and the same type, right? And it must have one return type. The return type is mandatory, but the input parameter is not mandatory. So when we need to use the Func delegate, whenever your delegate returns some value, whether by taking any input parameter or not, you need to use Func generic delegate in C#. So in this case, whenever your delegate returning some value by taking any input parameter or not, then in that case you need to use Func generic delegate. So if you look at this method, right? So if you look at this delegate which we have created, this delegate returning some value by taking some input parameter. And so this is the ideal scenario. Instead of creating this add number one delegate, you can use this Func delegate. How to use that we will see. So the point that you need to remember, whenever your delegate returning some data by taking some input values, then in that case you can use this Func generic delegate. Second, the next generic delegate is action delegate. So the action generic delegate is also present in the system namespace. Now, if you go to the action generic delegate, right, you will also see that this action generic delegate is also belongs to the system name. So this is not the generic delegate. So this is going to be the generic version of the action delegate. So if you look at this generic delegates belongs to the system namespace, right? So this delegate belongs to the system namespace. This delegate, this action generic delegate, right, takes one or more input parameters and returns nothing. This delegate can take maximum of 16 input parameters of different or same data type. What it means, now whenever your delegate does not return any value, whether by taking any input parameter or not, then you need to use action generic delegate. So in this case, you can see which delegate return. So in this case, you can see this add number 2 delegate, it doesn't return anything but taking some input parameter. So this is an ideal scenario where you can go with action generic delegate. So whenever your delegate does not return anything by taking some input values or not. So in this case, it is taking some input values, right? If it is not taking any input values, then that is also fine. But it is not returning anything, that is important. If it is not returning anything, then you can use action generic delegate. Now, the next one is a predicate generic delegate. The predicate generic delegate also belongs to the system namespace. This generic delegate is used to verify certain criteria of the method and returns the output as Boolean. That means if it is returning Boolean means what? It is either return true or false. It takes maximum one input parameter and always a return value which is mandatory, right? This delegate can take a maximum of one input parameter and always return going to return the Boolean type value. So whenever your delegate returns a Boolean value by taking only one input parameter, then you need to use predicate generic delegate. So in this case, if you first of all, let me check this delegate belongs to system namespace or not. Yes, it belongs to system namespace, right? And this is an ideal scenario, right? So where you can use the predicate generic delegate. So in this case, you can see the check length delegate, it is going to return me one Boolean value and it is taking one parameter. So whenever a delegate taking a maximum of one input parameter and if it is going to return me some Boolean data, right, then in that case, instead of creating a custom delegate, I can use this predicate generic delegate. So for these three different delegates, what we have created for to execute three different types of method. So instead of creating this custom delegate, we can make use of this generic delegate and we can all invoke this method. Now let us see how, right? So now let us see how. So the Func generic delegate is used whenever your delegate returns some value, whether by taking any input parameter or not. In our example, add number 1 method takes some input and returns some output. So add number method signature is matched with the Func generic delegate signature. So here, instead of creating our own delegate to invoke the add number 1 method, we can use Func generic delegate to invoke the add number 1 method. You can see this is using custom generic delegate. So what we have discussed this one. We created one add number 1 generic add number 1 delegate. Then we create an instance of add number 1 delegate, and to this instance we are passing this add number 1 method, and then we invoke. So instead of creating this add number 1 delegate and then creating an instance, so I can directly go with this one, Func generic delegate, new Func generic delegate, and in this case within the greater than and less than symbol, right? Within the greater than and less than symbol, we need to provide the parameter. This parameter is basically decide the number of input and output parameter. The last parameter in the parameter list is going to be the output parameter, and the rest of all are going to be the input parameter. So currently this Func generic delegate takes four parameter. Four parameter means this is the first three are input parameter and the last one is the output parameter. And the first three means integer, float, double. This is going to be input parameter, and the last one double is going to be the output parameter. Is that the same signature or as this add number one method? Yes. If you look at this add number one method, the input parameter are going to be integer, float, and double. And in this case, you can see integer, float, and double, integer, float, and double. And what is the output? Output parameter is double, and that is going to be the last parameter in the parameter list. So instead of creating add number one delegate, right, I can directly use this func delegate to invoke this add number one method, right? So this is how you can use func generic delegate. Now, how to use action generic delegate? The action generic delegate is used whenever your delegate does not return anything, right? Whether by taking any input parameter or not. In our example, if you look at the add number two method, then this method does not return anything but by taking three input parameters. If it is not taking input parameter, then also you can use action generic delegate, right? So you can see what we have used so far. We have declared one add number to delegate. Then we create an instance of a add number to delegate, and to this instance I'm passing this add number to method, right? So instead of creating this delegate, right, so I can directly use the action delegate, and to this action delegate I need to specify the input parameter. In this case, there is no output parameter. So here I'm passing three input parameter. Three parameter means all are going to be input parameters only, right? In the previous example, the last one is the output parameter, but in this case, there is no output parameter. If you are using action delegate means there is no output parameter, right? So if you go to the definition of action delegate, right, then you will see that the return type is void. As the return type is void means it is not going to return me anything, right? So in this case, instead of creating this delegate, I can directly use the action delegate and I can invoke the method in this way, right? And here maximum you can pass 16 input parameter, and in this case maximum you can pass 15 input parameter, and the last one is always going to be the output parameter, which is mandatory. Now, how to use a predicate generic delegate? See, the predicate generic delegate is used whenever your delegate return a boolean value by taking only one input parameter, right? Maximum one input parameter, and mandatory it is going to return a boolean value. In our example, check length method takes one input parameter of string type and returning a boolean value, right? So the check length method signature is matched with the predicate generic delegate signature. So here, instead of creating our one delegate to invoke the check length method, we can use the predicate generic delegate to invoke the check length method. See how? So this is how we have doing so far: creating one delegate, declaring one delegate, creating an instance of the delegate, and invoking the method. So instead of check length delegate, that custom delegate what we created, we can directly use the predicate, and to this predicate we just need to specify the input parameter string, and in this case no need to specify the output parameter or the return type, right? Because mandatory and by default it is going to return me some boolean value. So in this case I just need to specify the input parameter, right? And in this case you can see I'm specifying the method name check length, and I'm specifying the input parameter this method is expecting, that is string, and when I invoke this method then it is going to return me some boolean value. The predicate delegate takes maximum of one input parameter of any type and returns a boolean value, and we do not have to specify the return type value, as by default the return value is going to be boolean, right? So this is how we can use generic delegates, right? Let me copy the code, paste it here. Now you can see these are my three methods, right? You can see the method that we have created in our previous example, but in this case I'm not creating any custom delegate, right? So what I'm doing here now, I'm just using the generic delegate. This generic delegate func you need to use whenever your delegate or whenever you want to execute one method, that method taking some input parameter and returning some value. If the method taking some input parameter and returning some value, then in that case you can use this func generic delegate. And in this case add number method as the signature, you can say it is taking some input parameter and returning one boolean value. right? When you invoke this method, that what this method is returning, that will be stored inside this double variable. And action generic delegate basically you need to use when your method doesn't return anything, right? If your method return nothing, right? If the return type of the method is void, right? Whether that method taking any parameter or not, input parameter or not, if it is returning void, then in that case you can use this action generic delegate. You can see this add number to method, it is taking some input parameter, but the return type is void, right? So in this case you need to pass the input parameter, no need to pass for the output parameter, right? But for Func generic delegate, the first three are nothing but your input parameter, and the last one is going to be your output parameter. And in this case you just need to invoke the method, no need to write this double result equals to, because this method is never going to return you anything. The last one is predicate generic delegate, and you need to use this predicate generic delegate whenever your method, right, taking one input parameter of any type, and if it is returning one boolean type value, then in that case you need to use predicate generic delegate. So in this case you can see this check length method, it is taking some string name parameter, right, string parameter, and returning one boolean value, right? So in this case you can use this predicate generic delegate, and you can invoke this method, and this method is going to return you boolean type value. So you can store that value inside a boolean variable, right? So this is how you can use generic delegates in your application. Now run the application, and you will get the data, or you will get the output as expected as the previous example what we discussed using custom delegates, right? So the points to remember while working with generic delegate: Func, action, and predicate are generic inbuilt delegates that are present in system namespace, which are introduced in CSharp 3.0. All these three delegates can be used with the method, right? In this case, I can show you these delegates are using with the method, right? So in this case, these are nothing but method. But even apart from method, you can also use this generic delegates with anonymous method and the lambda expression, right? In our next two videos, we are going to keep focus on anonymous method and a lambda expression. The Func delegate can contain a maximum of 16 input parameter and must have one return type that will be the last parameter in the parameter list, right? Action delegate can contain a maximum of 16 input parameter and it doesn't have any return type. The predicate generic delegate satisfies some criteria of a method and must have only one input parameter. By default, it is having one output parameter of Boolean type, and we do not have to pass the output parameter